Well, it's my pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Casey Holliday, Associate Professor of Anatomy at University of Missouri. Dr. Holliday is a world expert on using the anatomy of muscles, nerves, connective tissues, and bones in modern reptiles and birds to understand the biology of dinosaurs and other extinct reptiles. He received his undergraduate degree in zoology from the University of Florida and a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from Ohio University, and has been faculty at the University of Missouri since 2009. He's published over 50 scientific articles and book chapters and guest edited several volumes. And I would also be remiss if I didn't point out that you'll see a lot of amazing 3D models in his talk today, and many of those are available publicly on Sketchfab to check out yourself, so I encourage you to do so. Take it away, Casey.
Thank you, Randy. Great. Thank you all for coming. It was a blast. I got to come here 5 years ago, also pre-pandemic. I have no recollection of what happened then. How many here like anatomy? How many here like math? All right. We're going to have some math today. I apologize now, but we can't help but talk about math a little bit when we start rebuilding things sometimes. Many of you are aware of kind of how paleontology works. There's some group of animals that gets washed away in a flood 65 million years ago in Canada. And over time they get buried and preserved, and then at some point some lucky group gets to start uncovering those fossils, right? And that's really cool. That's some of the romantic side of paleontology, where we get to kind of make giant jackets full of dirt that's really heavy and flip them and find out that maybe they have cool stuff in them, or maybe sometimes they're empty. All right, this is down at Ghost Ranch. But then we pull these fossils out, we spend a lot of time cleaning them up, and then when we get older, we get to take our own students to visit things like Sue at the Field Museum and try to figure out how these animals actually work and how they lived 65 million years ago or 70 million years ago, what have you. And this is really just a wonderful part of the field, is going from basically a live animal that was dead, that rotted, that got buried, we put it back together again, we study it again and try to figure out how it was living, and that's kind of how we work. And so we try to build these animals back in life through sculpture like 3D. This is a jaw muscle reconstruction by Brian Cooley of Sioux back in the day. This is a wonderful mount that's always been a favorite of mine down at the museum in Western Colorado, down in Grand Junction, where they kind of fleshed out a bunch of thigh muscles in a dinosaur. I really love this mount. I wish we had more of them out there. We can use 2D art as well to try to represent the lungs and the nerves and the muscles of a bunch of crocodiles. And I think Brian Eng is in here. This is something we did together when we were working out how T-Rex bit things. Obviously they bit things very violently in a very wet fashion. And this is where I wish we had one of those 4D experiences at Disney, where we bring this picture up and he got spritzed with fluid when it came up. Because every time I look at this thing, like our press office wouldn't even run this because they felt it was a little too wet. That's wonderful. So back in my lab, I don't get to go out and do field work too often to dig up old dead rocks. Instead, what I get to do is try to figure out how live animals work, or mostly dead animals, so we can then rebuild all the stuff back into dinosaurs. So we work on a lot of fossils, but really spend about 85% of our time working on recently living animals, and sometimes actually live animals. But we dissect animals like gharials, like this one that died in the zoo in Texas. We have iguanas from Florida, of all places. We saw things up with like regular hacksaws, we have bandsaws, we use histology, we use CAT scanners quite a bit. So we can scan everything from little tiny things inside of centrifuge tubes or Coke cans, all right, all the way into big medical CTs. All right, this is a Ceratosaurus brain case from down at the museum in Western Colorado. We're trying to kind of pull a brain out of it eventually. So we have a lot of time in our little lab at Missouri. We're pretty busy. We have chest freezers everywhere, all sorts of bladed objects that we then use to then cut up animals, all for the good of dinosaur science. Now, I teach medical school anatomy, so I teach soon-to-be doctors how we're all built. And we all have the same parts as dinosaurs do. We have the same muscles, the same nerves, the same bones, the same guts. We're just kind of stretched or squished or extruded in different ways. But all the same parts are there. So if you learn one species really, really well, like we might learn about ourselves, we can actually take all that information and often find evidence for these same little nerves or arteries or veins or muscles or ligaments back in the fossil record, if you have the right goggles on. And this is what we do, is we get these goggles and we try to figure out with weird X-ray vision how these animals can be built back with flesh back on them. And so we can get at nerves, which tell us about sensation and the behaviors of animals. We can get at jaw muscles and cranial joints and stuff like that to get at skulls, and I'll be talking about that today. We can get at blood vessels, which tell us something about the physiology of these animals too. All of these soft tissues leave bony signatures in the skeletons of all these fossils you see down in the halls through here. And with the right goggles again, we can find evidence of these soft tissues in the bones and actually sort of read it all like Braille in a way sometimes. So the last 20 years, particularly with the advent of kind of this idea that dinosaurs aren't just this old static rock thing, but in fact they were once living animals, we can kind of take this almost veterinary science approach to really figure out what these animals were built of outside of just the bones. And you know, if you saw yesterday's talk with Brian Ang and some other folks, they talked a lot about skin. I don't really deal with skin too much. I deal with everything deep to the skin. Because everything's kind of red on the inside. I don't care about the colors of feathers, colored skin. Everything's kind of red on the inside. But we've seen this wonderful revolution in understanding the soft tissues of dinosaurs the past couple decades. We've learned about air sacs and eyeballs. We've learned about blood vessels and muscles, which we'll be talking about today. We've figured out some of the nerves inside of jaws of these things, to figure out how sensitive their faces are, and this is done by Emily Lessner, who's over there slouching in her seat over there. We're starting to get an idea about what their lungs might have looked like, and dinosaurs like T-Rex here probably had unidirectional flow-like lungs like alligators and birds do. So we don't really have good evidence of lungs quite yet. Maybe we'll find some special fossil that has some traces of it. But we have an idea of how they breathe, and it's probably like birds and crocodiles, which makes sense. We know how big some of their articular cartilage might have been. We know that dinosaurs actually had much thicker cartilage than we do, and this likely affected a lot of the biomechanics of these animals, particularly sauropods. So when you go lay down next to that big like sauropod femur in the collections, think about how there's probably like half a foot of cartilage on the end of each of those ends of the bones there, right? We only have like a millimeter of cartilage, and we spend $1 billion trying to fix that all the time amongst us. These dinosaurs didn't have that kind of problem. They probably had other problems. Right? And we're finally kind of getting at maybe how the digestive system worked, or how the reproductive system worked through eggs and poop, you know, and that tells us something about guts. And I imagine one day we're going to find some fossilized soft tissues inside the bellies of these animals that might speak to some of these soft tissues as well. All right, so we can kind of get a lot of soft tissues out of understanding the bones and skeletons of these animals. Now, I'm going to get a little philosophical with you for a little bit. This is what's called the inverted pyramid of inference. It was kind of published a long time ago now. But the idea is that we basically are presented with bony data. These are the fossils that we dig out of the ground. And this serves as a foundation to then build up how these animals worked and evolved. So from skeletons of T-Rex, like the temporal fossil where all the muscles sit, we can get to the muscle anatomy and then the feeding mechanics and then get at behaviors of chewing, for example. But we really want to figure out, like, was T-Rex an active predator? Was it a scavenger? I think we're all talking about active predation these days. But we also want to understand how all these animals evolved over time, and those are the big questions. But the thing is, as an anatomist, if we mess up and make errors way down here at the base of the pyramid, then all these other inferences are also going to be problematic and full of errors too. So in my lab and the lab of some others, we try to do really good work down here trying to reconstruct soft tissues from the bones. Because again, we're presented with like Herrerasaurus over here, which is an animal found in the 220 million year old rocks of Argentina. The beautiful little thing up here has got this big old hole on the top that acts like a funnel called the Dorsal Temporal Fenestra, and that's where a lot of muscles tend to attach. So we want to get a good idea of what's attaching in there, so we really talk about the muscle anatomy, the biomechanics, and how all these animals work. All right, so back in 2003, I built this whole little schematic here talking about basically the spectrum of accuracy, and you'd think I listened to Pink Floyd a lot probably doing this, and I did. So we can get pretty good accuracy out of muscle attachments. We can get a good idea of where muscles attach to skulls. They're not too different from ours. Right? And that gets us, if we can rebuild muscles in 3D, that helps us figure out where nerves and arteries are passing through or between the muscles, because these things all go in very conservative ways. Okay? So we can kind of rebuild muscles, and we can kind of figure out where the nerves and the arteries are. In this brain case of T-Rex here, these are little muscle maps of where different jaw muscles were attaching. We can build these up in different hypotheses, like maybe there's a big muscle filling this fossa, maybe there's blood instead, and I'll get into that in a minute. Then we can start looking at all these different fossils in the collections like we have here in Utah, and get a sense for how all these different dinosaurs and croc relatives are really doing this. So then what we've really been doing the last 10 years is turning the soft tissue anatomy and turning it into 3D models. Because with 3D models, we can figure out volumes and vectors of muscles. This is where the math and engineering comes in, so everybody run if you don't want to hear about it. All right? But with 3D, we can tell you how actually big a muscle is. And if we know how big a muscle is, we can tell you how strong it might have been. If we can tell you how strong a muscle was, and we get all the other muscles together, we can tell you how hard T-Rex did, or what we think it did, within a range. So that really gets at kind of how these animals were working. And our models have shown kind of the T-Rex, at least, has about 80 gallons of muscles, all right? So, think about a 55-gallon barrel of stuff, and then add a half a barrel, and that's how much meat, right, is inside a T-Rex head that helps it bite. That's a lot. That's like a couple of you together worth of muscle, okay? And they bite about 60,000 newtons. Does anybody know what 60,000 newtons really means to a duck-billed dinosaur? No. It's like 14,000 pounds of pressure per inch. Does anybody know what that means in reality? Not really. So what this means is like T-Rex could bite as hard as it needed to eat whatever it wanted to, right? And it has a skull that can handle these forces, and which is really cool. So we have this big old head that's 5 feet long and 4 feet tall and 4 feet wide, that's chock full of muscles, and it bites through whatever it kind of wants to, which is great. That's evolution. Now when I made this back in 2003, we weren't thinking we could ever get at muscle architecture, how all the little fascicles and fibers in each muscle might differ amongst animals. Right? That's really hard to get at. We have to dissect things one little fascicle at a time. That gets it like pennation, like we have really parallel fibered muscles in our biceps, right, which gives us excursion and speed. We have really pinnate muscles in our pectoralis muscles, which gives us power but not a lot of excursion. All right? So we can kind of get at this now, and I'm going to talk about a little bit of this today. And I never thought we'd see this 20 years ago. Finally, there are things about muscles like histochemistry and other physiological things that are probably really out of reach for fossils, but let's come back in 20 years and we'll prove me wrong then too. All right? This is all really important because we can build all this stuff. We can get at the structure, the function, the performance, and then ultimately the evolution of the clades we like, the lineages we want to study. Whether it be theropod dinosaurs, crocodiles, which I love, go gators. Right? And this is why we're here. We're all natural historians. We want to figure out how animals lived back in the past, how they changed over time. This is the real meat of paleontology. So I really like to study archosaurs. Archosaurs are a group of reptiles that include crocodilians and birds and dinosaurs and also pterosaurs today. And we have a problem in that modern day archosaurs, like crocs and birds, don't look anything like their ancestors. They don't look like dinosaurs much, unless you have the right kind of goggles, okay? And their skulls work really differently from one another. Crocs, like this gharial here, is eating a fish cake. Their jaws largely just kind of do this, up and down mostly. All right, pretty simple. Birds, on the other hand, involve what's called craniokinesis. If you watch the upper bill of this macaw, it's moving separate from the lower jaws as well as the brain case. So birds have evolved a bunch of hinges and extra muscles in their head, different from what T-Rex and some of their velociraptor ancestors had, which allows them to do a lot of different things with their head their ancestors couldn't. But if we're trying to study these old things like quote-unquote nanotyrannus here, right? We have to try to figure out the anatomy of all these things, going backwards in time, understanding modern anatomy, going backwards in time, putting that stuff into dinosaurs, and then figuring out how all this stuff evolved and how it worked. So, one of the first stories I'm going to tell you today is one about the dorsotemporal fenestra. Now, a lot of you have heard about this nomenclature called synapsid or diapsid, and this refers to the number of holes in the head. So we are synapsids. We have one large hole in our head. We have a jugal bar, or the zygomatic process. Right, but then no upper temporal bar up here like reptiles tend to have. So our temporalis muscles kind of squish out of the space on the side of our head. You can feel them move when you chew. Yep, those are temporalis, okay? Reptiles in general are considered diapsids. We used to think turtles were called anapsids, meaning they didn't have any holes in their head, but we've had a nice fossil record of turtles now. That suggests they're also two-hole skulled animals, diapsids. So for the longest time, we'd look at these holes, and old school paleontologists would be like, yeah, all these holes here allow for the bulging of jaw muscles. The jaw muscles are kind of hanging out of this space. These are some specialized contrast images of a gecko, an alligator, and a parrot. And these are all muscles. You can now see with cat scanning. I'm going to talk about this at the end of the class. All right. Squamates, so they fill the whole fossa here, and they kind of bulge out the skull roof up there with the skin. Right? And gators have actually pretty small temporalis muscles. They bite hard, but they do it with other muscles down here, the pterygoides muscles. Okay? Birds kind of have, depending on what kind of bird you're studying, they have big jaw muscles, small ones. But they all kind of occupy this thing called the dorsal temporal fenestra. Again, that's the space on the side of our head right here. we have big brains that make it look really weird. So in general, if we kind of make a little kind of cartoon of what this anatomy looks like, we have a big old funnel filling the space in the side of the head. It's filled with muscle, and there's skin on top. This is kind of the old school classic way of interpreting this anatomy. So back when I was kind of pulling drawers and looking at fossils a lot, which I still do, we were kind of met with some challenges trying to read the Braille. And so this is Herrerasaurus again, and this is this general funnel of the dorsal-temporal fenestra. Right? And there are a couple awful words I'm going to be throwing around, but in general there's a space here called the dorsotemporal fossa, which is actually where the temporal muscles attach. But then we kept on running into this little shelf, kind of on top of the orbit almost in Herrerasaurus here. And the shelf was kind of weird. It didn't really fit the bill for where muscles should be attaching. It's got some weird bumps and grooves that don't really kind of jive with how muscles attach to things. So we really started trying to get at that. So again, here's this dorsal-temporal fossa where the jaw muscles attach. But then we have this other thing called the frontoparietal fossa. Everybody say it together, frontoparietal fossa. Oof. All right? Yeah, anatomists are the worst. So this kind of old school hypothesis, so to speak, is we still have the funnel here, but paleontologists would often just stick these temporal muscles not only up in the back portion of this fossa, so to speak, up on the nuchal crest, which is legit, but they'd also make these muscles kind of flop on top of the orbit into this fossa, like this little kind of cartoon muscle here. So we kind of rebuild this cartoon like this, like it's a modified funnel with this muscle flopped out over the orbits. Okay? So this is kind of weird, and so I do a lot of biomechanics also. And first things first is that we kind of started looking at this, and it didn't really look like a muscle could fit there, because it wouldn't really work very well if it was kind of going this 90-degree angle to get up on top of the skull. Because we like our muscles to have really direct lines of actions, right, to move things. You just think about every muscle in your body. Very few muscles have to wrap around things. Our knee is one of the few things. And the thing that's special about our knee that allows our quadriceps muscles to bend around our knees is a sesamoid bone called the patella, or kneecap. And so when muscles like to wrap around bone, they develop sesamoids. And we don't really have any evidence of this sort of thing in the skull roots of dinosaurs. So really, it's kind of a biomechanically bad place to put a muscle. All right, they don't work, they lose all the force. The vectors don't line up or add up to really make that muscle very useful. And so this is kind of some negative evidence to suggest this thing doesn't have muscle. We have other animals that do have wrapping muscles that kind of wrap around things like our knees. Alligators, they have muscles that wrap around this big buttress. They form a sesamoid, and this is only like a 160-degree angle. Turtles also wrap their muscles over the backs of their ears so they can fit their heads into their shells. And they too have this little sesamoid inside their jaw muscles where they only wrap around like, 120 degrees. These are really oblique angles, shallow angles, and we still see sesamoids form. If we did this with Diplodocus or Majungasaurus or a Tyrannosaur, these are really, really acute angles for muscles to wrap around and still be effective. We don't have any evidence for sesamoids. We don't have little rounded trochlea that we see, like kind of these little raised parts of bone that would suggest a sesamoid was there. So we kind of are lacking evidence to suggest the muscle was attaching in this frontoparietal fossa. Okay? Well, that's kind of weird. What else is going on up there? Well, it turns out, so we injected a bunch of alligators and birds with contrast into their arteries and some in the veins, and that's what's lighting up here in CT. It turns out that these animals actually have quite a bit of blood vessels, kind of actually between the muscles and the skin. And they also happen to be excavating some of that frontoparietal fossa. So there's an alligator, you see this beautiful ring of vessels. There's actually arteries and veins running together. It's a little air conditioning system. So there's a countercurrent heat exchanger up there that plugs into the orbit, the neck, as well as the brain. Birds are a little weird. This is a turkey, and when you inject it full of contrast in its arteries, it lights up all that weird red skin that turkeys have called carunculate skin. The arteries go into their snoots, they go into their wattles, all right? And so birds actually use a lot of the same blood vessels that largely emanate out of the same area, the frontoparietal fossa, to supply all the skin on the roofs of their heads. So muscles aren't really kind of hanging out here, but instead maybe blood vessels are. And so we built some little models. These are arteries and veins in the alligator, and this is a turkey head. And so here's that little vascular loop in alligators. It's excavating. That little notch right there is a frontoparietal fossa. So there's not a muscle up there, but instead there's blood vessels. Okay? Birds are a little derived and weird, but we still have most of the same system kind of hanging out in this space. So now we can kind of go back to this cartoon and say, well, maybe there's a funnel of muscle But in between the muscle and skin, we might actually have vasculature there, which is maybe important. So we don't really have good evidence for muscles up in this frontal parietal fossa, but instead we're kind of imagining some sort of mixture of arteries and veins up on the skull roof that are fed by vessels that come from a couple different places in the head. So again, there's alligator and an iguana and the Jungosaurus, which is from Madagascar, and a turkey. So we can kind of map out these soft tissues in all these animals, whether they're alive or dead. All right? And all these different vessels kind of form a circuit in the head, and we have a lot of these same vessels in our head as well. But these temporal orbital vessels in particular, the ones that are forming the little ring, up in this fossa, they plug into occipital vessels on the back of the neck. They plug into arteries on the skull roof, the supraorbital arteries that then feed into the orbit. And they also then feed into facial arteries that all help form like snoods and things on the heads of things. So there's a little kind of flow chart that shows this FPF, frontal parietal fossa vessels. They communicate with the neck. They communicate with the orbit, the eyeball, which is a big place for temperature regulation, okay? As well as the skull roof integument. We have a little bit of evidence that shows these arteries might communicate through the brain, certainly indirectly, but also perhaps directly through some different holes in the skull roof itself, which is cool. Animals really care about, and we do too, my brain is very hot right now, which is why I'm starting to sweat. Animals really pay attention to how hot their brains get, because if they get too hot, your body doesn't work anymore and you die. So animals have a lot of different mechanisms to maintain active or proper brain temperature and then body temperature, okay? So why do we want to have a bunch of blood up on the skull roof anyway? If it's not muscle, what are they doing with all the blood? Well, so paleontologists, we usually have two answers for this. One is that it's there for ornamentation. So we know that these blood vessels will pipe out of the skull roof of crocodiles. So this is a shield croc. This is actually a big vascular groove coming out of the hole and onto the skull roof with this weird boss up here. All right, this is all like a vascular area on the skull roof of this crocodile. This is a pterosaur. I never thought I'd say pterosaur out loud at a public talk, but here we go. We actually can see traces of blood vessels on the crest of Thalassodromeus, emanating from the same group of vessels that we're talking about today. And we've long thought actually that a lot of these animals had pretty spectacular display structures perhaps. Luis Rey made this wonderful drawing of a very adorned velociraptor with snoods and wattles and all sorts of carunculate skin. And we see the same kind of art coming from Brian Heng these days too, which I love and adore. I love Brian, I know you're somewhere. Now, the other answer we have is that, maybe the blood vessels are for thermal regulation, temperature control. And we know that, bunny ears are there to help not only hear predators, but also shed heat if they need to, like elephant ears. We know the bills of birds have a lot of capillaries in them that let them control temperature. Okay, so wow, maybe these blood vessels on the skull roof are also thermal devices, or what we call thermal windows, places where animals can control their brain and body temperature through blood vessels in their skin. Okay? So to kind of test some of this hypothesis, I got a guy with a thermal camera, and we went down to the St. Augustine Gator Farm in St. Augustine, Florida. Go Gators. And this is a gator pit. So if you're ever there, they have all these, 1,000-pound alligators hanging around in this pit. And we went down there in February, and it was actually kind of a early 50-degree Fahrenheit day in February in Florida. It was a lovely morning. It was kind of cool, like cold for Florida. And it was just really cool. So here we go. This is the first thing we saw. This is about 8:30 in the morning, so the temperature is about 50 degrees. There's this big old alligator. Nope. One sec. Coming out of the water. So I'm taking the video, and I got my colleague here with the thermal camera.
Yeah, come on.
So this gator's been in the water all night. It's cold.
Awesome.
Awesome with me.
Wow, look at that.
So our first pictures from the morning started supporting this hypothesis that these things are using blood vessels on the roof of their head to help control body temperature. That's that first picture. So, snout's cold, body's starting to warm up, little keels on the scoots are cold though, that's a whole other dissertation. And then there's this hot spot right up here where those holes in the skull are, behind the eyes. Okay, that's the first picture we got. So I was like dancing around. Like, whoa! All right. We messed around with gators all day, and we could play videos of this all day. It's a hoot. But besides skulls, so the cool thing about St. Augustine is we could actually go on these railings and take pictures over the heads of gators to get on top of the gators. And you can imagine that's good, because you don't want to be near their mouths, right? We also shot cameras down the throats of some of these gators, because gators, you know, hang out and bask in the sun with their mouths open. That's gators panting. Actually, they do that to actually shed heat. And when they have their mouths open like that, their tongues are often panting a little bit to help bring air over all these capillary beds in their mouths, you know, to shed heat. They're not really heating up. This is Bomber. He's like a 14-foot alligator. He's pretty well trained. He's getting tickled by the stick.
Sounds like me.
So we have Kent Bleak, who's an alligator behaviorist, and the keeper doing the stick work here. All right, get big. Open up. Ambulance is on there ready for me. There, guys. So that's the picture, right?
Come on, take a picture. There we go.
That's the last thing you want to see. All right. And that's our picture, right? The mouth is really cold, as it should be. Right? Other parts of them are warm, cool, doesn't really matter in this case. But we're trying to get really cool thermal imaging to try to talk about physiology of the blood vessels in these animals. We went to a wild area outside of Gainesville, Florida called Payne's Prairie, where we tried to get images of wild alligators basically in their habitat. And this wasn't really successful. This is like a 7-foot gator, and this is as close as I was allowed to get to it. And you cannot get a camera up on top of their skull roof to get good pictures. Right? So that didn't quite work. But from the zoo work and everything else, we actually basically learned that alligators have this loop of blood vessels up here in their dorsal temporal fenestrae that they can actually turn on and off during the day. So early in the morning, these things are hot relative to everything else. So they're kind of collecting radiant energy from the sun, so we think, and they're helping heat up their brain, heat up their body, so they can go about their gator business during the day. Later in the day, when things start getting hot, look at those blue holes right there. Now they're turning these things off, we think. And so they're able to kind of cool themselves down, perhaps, through these same vessels, or perhaps just turning them off and worrying about other things. All right? So this is really great data, and we have this is different crocodile species. We have data from all sorts of croc species from the zoo. All these support that these blood vessels on the skull roof were probably helping with thermophysiology of these alligators. We could still do the same work with birds one of these days if we get money to do it. But this led us to have Brian Eng do this work for us. Where's Brian? Brian, there he is in the back, yo. So imagine you're in a canoe down in the Guha Formation of Big Bend, Texas, and you stumble upon the Spletosaurus hanging out with this food of some Cavnosaur or whatever's down there, with a couple Deinosuchuses kind of crowded in a little bit, right? With a thermal camera from the canoe, this is probably what we think these animals were doing, was kind of heating up their heads with these blood vessels on their skull roof. There's a little bird up here hanging out, watching and waiting. All right? This is kind of our idea of taking anatomy, right? We have this weird structure in the skull. We thought it was muscle, but it's not. We said, okay, well, what are some other alternative hypotheses? We tested these out and decided they're blood vessels, or found evidence that they're blood vessels, and kind of tested that out through actual live animal physiology. And so for now, we have a pretty good idea that these are probably here for thermoregulation, but they can also still use these vessels for display structures that they want. Okay? This is kind of how the whole process works, right? You can use anatomy, physiology, and mechanics to really get at how these dinosaurs might have worked in the past. The next part of my talk, I want to talk about muscle efficiency. So we have big brains, most of us, except for Florida State Seminoles. And our two groups of animals today are built quite differently. We want to know how all these muscles work, but also the muscles of dinosaurs. And muscles like to be efficient. They want to be oriented in a way that allows them to provide the most efficient force delivery to do whatever behavior they're trying to do. So we have all these big crushing molars, and our masseter muscles and our temporalis muscles are very vertically oriented to kind of deliver that nice crushing bite to carrots or fingers, or for the big vertical force delivery. And T-Rex is too, for what it's worth. We got into a big NSF grant to look at crocodiles to get at this. Crocs are really cool in that today's crocs have really flat heads, right? They kind of evolved to kind of hang in the water and pounce on things. But their ancestors had very tall skulls, kind of like T-Rex in a way. This is Prestosuchus, which is kind of like this big chungus type of quadrupedal crocodile ancestor from Brazil that lived about 230 million years ago. This is Jungersuchus, an early croc relative from China, and this is alligator. All right? And notice how tall this skull is here. Sort of tall, not so tall anymore. And if we put this in a top-down view, you can see how flat they get. In crocs in general, they have this really cool extreme feeding performance that we have today. They bite pretty hard, they do the torsional death rolling thing. They have really heavily built skulls. They have fairly simple jaw movements, all right? And they have a wonderful fossil record. So we got all this money to go scan all these crocodile fossils and build basically 3D vectors of muscles in all these skulls to figure out the orientations and forces of these muscles in 3D. So this is Reveltosaurus, which is from petrified forest. This is Prestosuchus, Jungersuchus. This is a thing called Gomphosuchus, sort of, this still needs to be properly described. Arariposuchus is from Argentina, and that's alligator. These plots are called ternary plots. I don't want to talk about them too much, but each of these dots represents a single jaw muscle. The size of the dot is relative force. And the pyramid is basically the top of the triangle is vertical, all right? The other corner down here, I have some of these labeled, I swear. These are rostrocaudally oriented things. And then the other point is mediolateral. So this is a way we can show the orientation of a vector in the same plot, regardless of what direction that muscle vector is in. Okay? So basically what you can see is down here in the primitive crocker ancestors, most of the muscles, these are all like the temporal muscles, are all very vertically oriented. Right? And then as you move your way up to these flat-headed alligators, these dots, these polka dots, start sort of plinkoing their way down into the mediolateral or horizontal spaces of vectors. So again, they go from vertical forces, right, to more horizontally oriented muscles and forces in modern gators. That doesn't make a lot of sense, right? If you want to bite really hard, like orthal bites, vertical forces, you want your muscles vertical, because that's efficient, right? Well, it's not really the case in crocs. And in fact, we kind of found that during croc evolution, the temporalis muscles became less efficient or less efficiently oriented over time. And these big pterygoideus muscles, they kind of hang out in the same space in the plot. They're kind of migrating around. There's probably a story in there for some other talk. Right? But for the most part, we see that there's this change in orientation of muscles during croc evolution. What my student Caleb Sellers did was figure out this kind of equation for muscle efficiency. And all this is a triangle with two sides and a hypotenuse. Or if you're taking a path, you have the long way and you have the shortcut. And in this case, the shortcut is the efficient way of actually doing things, much different than real life usually. All right? So we can kind of measure the efficiency of muscles and pardon the equations, but we have to do it sometimes. But the idea is that the more non-vertical a muscle gets, the less efficient it's going to get at delivering vertical forces, right? That makes sense. Okay? And so what we basically found is that croc ancestors, like Prestosuchus up here, has much more efficient muscles than modern crocodiles today, just based on orientations of the muscles alone. Okay? But it's kind of weird. We often think of evolution being sort of progressing in a way, in a good way, so we think. Right? So we'd expect alligators to be like optimal after all these million years of evolution. But in fact, they actually have very suboptimally oriented jaw muscles for at least biting up and down. They have to do a lot of shaking and twisting, which some of these muscles might be really good for, frankly. So it's kind of weird. So we see this trade-off basically between skull shape and muscle efficiency in crocs. So again, fossil crocs way down here have really fairly high muscle efficiency. They have tall skulls, vertically oriented muscles for delivering vertical forced bites. As we make our way towards modern crocs up here, these kind of cool or reddish colors down here mean they're becoming less efficient. In modern crocs, they have less efficient muscles, orientation-wise, than their ancestors did, which is kind of weird. So what did they do? It turns out that modern-day crocs, or living crocs today, actually rescued themselves. So they rescued this suboptimal muscle orientation by basically increasing muscle size and increasing muscle forces. This is why you get muscles kind of swooshing out of the backs of gator heads. Right? So they basically don't have room to pack enough muscle in there anymore. It starts kind of squishing out the back. They have muscles that creep up into their face now, all to make more room for more meat. So they still have suboptimally oriented muscles, but they pack more muscle in there now to make up for that lack of optimal orientation. I hope this makes sense. Our future is relying on it. Now, how do they really do this, right? How do they increase force? And this is kind of where we're going in the next step. So maybe they increase pination. Maybe they get more fiber architecture in these muscles so there's more power, right? Maybe they have joints that help deal with these forces in ways that are somewhat different from their ancestors, all right? And maybe they have different behaviors now anyways. Maybe they don't have to worry about this up and down gator chomp. Maybe they care more about all this other transverse and torsional feeding. And those are where they need the muscle forces. So that's cool, right? For some reason, alligators have less efficient muscle orientations than their ancestors did. But they're still trying to fix it somehow by maybe increasing forces, increasing pronation, some way to recover those forces, right, in their heads so they can still kind of bite really hard. Okay. The other side of the coin here are birds. Now, like I said earlier, birds have really flexible heads. They have extra joints in their head that give them really flexible joint. I'll say all the same words again in the same sentence. They can kind of move all these parts around. The one thing we know about the origin of birds really well is that they got really big brains. So when these things were all little like squirrel dinosaurs flitting around, they had to get big ears and big eyes and big brains to deal with that complicated 3D environment in the trees. They need that to then be able to fly, right? And so we have great fossil record evidence of how brains of things like early, like this is Citipodi and Oviraptor, and this is like a Velociraptor here, and this is Archaeopteryx, and that's a chicken. The brains start getting really big in these animals. Birds have large eyes, they lose their teeth, they also lose their upper temporal bar, all right, which is this bar up here in Dromaeosaurus. Birds don't have that anymore, all right? They also went through this bottleneck of miniaturization, we think, which affects the relative sizes of things. But then they basically got flappy and started flying, and they needed smaller, lighter heads, so we think. And so they're going to ditch bones, they might ditch muscles. So we think these are all the old ideas behind how birds turned into birds. But overall, there's basically this giant kind of reorganization of musculoskeletal anatomy. So you have a flexible head now instead of a stiff skull like T-Rex. You need muscles oriented in different ways to do that. And we're blaming it all on big brains. So we built a ton of 3D models of dinosaurs over the last couple of years through a different NSF grant. Allosaurus is down here at the bottom, there's T-Rex, there's Erlikosaurus, there's Citipodi, there's Dromaeosaurus. We don't have any 3D models of Mesozoic birds because the steamroller of the Mesozoic just flattens them all. We have a hard time getting 3D models of bird skull, fossil birds. We have ostriches and chickens and parrots and all sorts of stuff up here. What we learned is that as the brains got really big, they actually changed the shape of the brain case, just like us, right? We have big brains that kind of inflate this whole part of our skull. And so when we look at increased encephalization, so brains start getting big as we go up the tree towards birds, their brain cases change from this kind of trapezoidal inward shape. So a lot of the jaw muscles at this point were fairly vertically oriented, all right? And they had lots of room for jaw muscles in there because they had little puny brains. As we get up to birds, the brain inflates, and so it changes the brain case to this outward trapezoid shape, so to speak. And what does that mean as the brain gets big? It crowds out the muscles. It crowds out that upper temporal bar. All right, so there's no room for that stuff without getting really, really big. Okay, but these are still little squirrel dinosaurs, right? So the shape of the brain case of the skull changes as the brain gets big. All right, and that's just the same tree showing the same thing I just said. Then we start mapping on all these jaw muscles again. So there's a chicken, and that's T-Rex. And if you go to the Sketchfab site, so Sketchfab, sketchfab.com, and find Holliday Lab, we have all these 3D models up there that you can, most of them are freely downloadable, and you can then print them. Okay? But basically, here are those same ternary plots. And here's T-Rex. You can see most of its jaw muscles are way up at the top of that dorsoventrally oriented part of the plot. Pretty optimally oriented, right? Chickens, on the other hand, nobody ever worries about being bitten by a chicken, right? But all these dots are kind of falling down to this more rostrocaudal or mediolateral orientation. All right, so they're not really purely vertical anymore, but they're starting to actually slope down this way, if you're looking at me right now. And you can see that in these arrows. So they're kind of slooped backwards more, because that brain got big and crowded the muscles out basically behind the brain now. What that means is that chickens have fairly suboptimally oriented muscles for at least biting down vertically. Chickens don't really do that, right? They peck, they go foraft, right? And this makes sense. We'll look at all these different dinosaurs and birds. Here's T-Rex down here, and I don't expect you all to get all this into your brains right now. But basically, as you look at T-Rex and Allosaurus down here, all these little polka dots are at the top of the triangle plot. As you work your way up the tree towards birds, they start plinkoing their way down sort of this rostrocaudal axis of the triangle. So these muscles start off being vertical, and they start shifting this way. which means they're not as optimal for vertical forces anymore. They're going to start doing other things. They're going to start changing behaviors. This actually starts changing loads of a lot of their joints in the palate, and it starts changing how their whole skull works. So what we basically see is the temporal muscles, right, they kind of track with big brains. They start getting crowded out of the way and shifting in this kind of posterior way. Pterygoideus muscles are their own story again. And protractor muscles, what I haven't talked about, they're kind of flitting around too, and these are controlling how the palate moves in birds. So birds and snakes have mobile palates, or the bones of the roof of the mouth, and they have special muscles that deal with that. But that's a different talk also. So what this all means, though, is that we can look at the muscles and look at efficiency. This is muscle volumes relative to body size. That's what a residual is, for what it's worth. Right? And this is brain case shape. Right? And what this basically means is that muscle volume size actually kind of is pretty high because the allosaurus is kind of hiding up in here. But as we make our way to birds, their muscles don't really change relative size too much given head size. So this means that muscles aren't changing size very much during all this evolutionary time. In fact, T-Rex is right here. They actually have less jaw muscle than we'd expect for a head that size. Why is that? Because they're already optimally oriented. So they don't need a lot of meat in there to really do stuff because they're already in a really nice position to do stuff. So they actually have less muscle than we think for their body size, which is kind of weird to think about. And again, nobody ever worries about being bitten by a chicken. Okay? So what this means is that muscle force efficiency also, which is again that same triangle of force that we looked at before crocodiles, this means that actually muscle force efficiency decreased along the line of birds, just like we saw in crocs. So brains got big, skulls changed shape, which shifted the orientations of jaw muscles, which led to them to be at least less efficient for vertical forces. There's a lot more going on in heads than just vertical forces, but this is a public talk and I don't want you to kill me, all right? But again, both clades of living archosaurs, both clades of living ancestors or living relatives of dinosaurs have been on these evolutionary trajectories of, let's say, suboptimal muscle orientations. Which again is kind of weird, it's contrary, we like to think evolution improves everything. In this case, it's not improving vertical forces, but they're doing different things with their muscles. And that's kind of the short story for now. Right, so that's cool, that's what math can tell us. We have a paper coming out that's going to use this, but it gets a lot crazier after these plots, and we'll save that for next time Randy invites me to come talk. So basically, that's kind of what you said, both crocs and birds have less efficient muscles than we expected them to, as well as less than what their ancestors did. So how do they rescue their heads? How do they rescue their muscles from these suboptimal orientations? Do they change muscle architecture? They change their feeding behaviors, that's for sure. Birds got kinesis and they're doing all sorts of things with their muscles. All right? And their bones and joints change. And last time I was here, 5 years ago, we talked about finding cartilages in joints of T-Rex and what it meant for how they work. So how do we get a pennation? So maybe if muscles are becoming more pennate along these animals to increase the force that they can generate, how do we even get at that in the fossil record? I don't know yet. Maybe you guys can tell me. But one thing we've been doing in the lab a lot lately is dunking animals in iodine. If you ever go to the ER and you have a laceration, they put a little bit of iodine tincture on you, right? That actually not only kills bacteria and fungus, but it also adds contrast to our soft tissues. So there's a human hand. I work in a donor program, so they consented to this for what it's worth. And rather than a regular CT, some of you probably have had regular CTs, and I'm sorry that you did. You see bone really well, but you don't see soft tissues very well. Iodine, on the other hand, if you have like a GI problem, they might put a little flash of iodine in your IV. It binds to, it binds to lipids and glycogens in our tissues, which then when you micro CT it, it lights up the nerves and the muscles, like nobody's business. So this is our hand with all the tendons and muscles in it. This is an alligator. This is a micro MRI of an alligator. Up here you can see, sort of not bone, but brain really well, muscles sort of. This is now micro CT with iodine in it. So now you can actually see the nerves that Emily Lester was talking about yesterday. Here, these are the jaw muscles on either side. This is done in 2011 with 83 micron data in a micro CT. Technology keeps getting better and better. So this is the same alligator 8 years later, and with better resolution. We've cooked it a little bit more, so the brain's not any good anymore. But now you can see all the muscle fibers really well, all these little strands or fascicles in the muscles. This is a gecko. This is a possum. Right? This is the nicest data set on the planet right now. You see all the muscles of the possum. You see the little tiny muscles in the possum ears. which are crazy, right? And we can now, with all this data, we can now get at tenacious. We've been doing a lot of this work lately. As again part of an NSF grant. We've been documenting kind of soft tissue ontology of alligators. Again, this is Emily Lesser's work. There's a little embryo gator there, just pulled out of the egg. We can dunk in an iodine or some other contrast agent, and then we start seeing how the heart develops, or how the jaw arches and muscles develop. And we do this with a range of alligators. We can also start working through museum collections and get different species of alligators or crocodiles that are preserved in formalin. We dunk them in iodine for sometimes months at a time, and then micro-CT them so we can then see all the soft tissues. And then my poor students have to color individual slices of data in dark rooms for their careers until we figure out smart enough computers that can do this without people. So we've been able to pull out brains and nerves and stuff. There's a little embryo gator that Emily did. This is the brain, muscles, nerves. There's a little embryo. It's like the size of your like pinky fingernail almost, maybe. We can also start using specialized software. All right, so these are 3D modeled muscle fibers and fascicles of an alligator. And what we're doing these days is we're using machine learning. We feed it micro-CT data. We kind of teach it what a muscle fiber looks like, and then hit run. And then somewhere between an hour and a day sometimes, it will then spit out something that looks like this, where you get an idea of all the different muscle fibers in the muscles of an alligator, a bird, or a human, or a primate of some sort, which is really cool, which means we can now measure all this stuff. So now all those horrible muscle efficiency things I showed you before, now we can do that with every one of these fascicles. So now we're doing this with like 2,000 points on a triangle plot instead of just a couple, which tells us about the pennation of muscles in 3D, which is really going to change how we kind of look at how muscles work. We do this with MRI data of people too. So a lot of stuff in the lab we're doing right now isn't necessarily dinosaurs, I'm sorry to say, but we're looking at the evolution of grasping in primates and us. We're special because we can hold stuff with our thumbs. So we have this tub of fluid at the lab that's got gorilla arms, chimpanzee arms, other monkey arms, human, that we're all basically studying how the thumb muscles work and how they evolve across the clade. We're looking at flight muscles of birds, like the starling over here. This is the pectoralis muscles here and the little chicken tender muscles hiding in there. We're doing this with neck muscles of primates to figure out how tarsiers can turn their heads 270 degrees using muscle architecture. We do this with birds in a big way. We're working with the Brookfield Zoo to figure out how pangolin tongues work. Those weird armored anteaters that are going to be extinct in the next 10 years. They have these wild tongues with wild muscles in them. And we're using the same approaches to try to figure out how they work. And there's a shark that I picked up at the beach at home that a fisherman left. And these are all the muscles of a dogfish that we can now measure orientations of every one of these fascicles and then get at shark feeding if we wanted to. I really don't want to do sharks. Other people can do sharks. It's too much. But this is where we're at now with anatomy, right? We went from kind of having to make two-dimensional drawings of things and then kind of sketch out anatomy in a way from dissections. But now using a mixture of 3D imaging like CAT scanning with contrast and machine learning and kind of coloring, we can now kind of see all these soft tissues in ways that we never thought we could before. So to kind of wrap up, I mean, soft tissue is still the key to understanding dinosaur biology. We want to read these bones like Braille. We want to figure out what nerves and muscles and skins and all sorts of stuff, how they're interacting with the skeletons. We can rebuild things accurately. Because we can get the anatomy accurately, we can start kind of getting at forces accurately and behaviors accurately and how these things actually might have worked in, let's say, orthopedic sense, for example. And then finally the future, and if I come back in 5 or 10 years, or maybe I won't get invited back again, but we're also trying to then use these machine learning and contrast and 3D visualization approaches to really map out muscle architecture in 3D in ways that we've never really thought we could before. Like 2003 when I made that original plot, we never could do it. But here I just was lazy and I grafted our alligator onto our little T-Rex thing here. It's not accurate. But we have ways of kind of estimating or modeling the architecture of muscles using bracketing. So we take bird architecture and alligator architecture and find a happy place and do some biomechanical tests. We might be able to get at the muscle architecture of muscles and things like T-Rex. So maybe I'll see it again in a couple of years. So I have to give all these thanks to all these wonderful students who work in my lab. We had, I don't know how many people we had in 2018. We had a lot of people in the lab in 2018. We diminished during the pandemic. We're down to about 5 people in the lab now, which is still great. But we have all sorts of wonderful undergrads and grad students that do a lot of the work here. I'm really the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain, and they're doing all the work. And so with that, thank you all. Thanks to Randy and this wonderful museum for having me, and thank you for all of you for being here, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Don't have to mute.
When you were talking about the crocodiles and the bite force not being vertical strong, with the excessive bunching of muscles behind skull, is that more like for a stronger hold?
Yeah, that's a good question. So are all these big muscles there not for just like that snap, but the hold, right? That's the thing, right? The bench press or whatever, probably. So again, there's lots of behaviors that go into feeding. That first initial capture has to be fast, and then you want that hold force. And again, those pterygoides muscles are really good at creating the strong force later, for sure. That's good. Yeah, in the back. Hi.
Is there a place that we can find out more about the work that you're doing? And do you think that there's maybe something in the past couple of years, like a big breakthrough that you want to talk about that maybe is really important to your work?
Yeah, well, you can find me on the internet pretty easily. This work here I presented is pretty much some of our best stuff in terms of scope and new ideas and new computational approaches to doing this work. Nobody else is kind of doing this quite yet. We've been very privileged to have money to be able to scan things in CT scanners, which is hard and requires lots of help from staff at museums like this to make it happen. So we don't have giant sample sizes because of that, but it means that we get to work on the best specimens, the trophies that are not crushed. They're beautiful, and we get to do work on that thing. So we try to, all of our models are high fidelity in a way, instead of having lots and lots of, let's say, kind of rougher models that we might see sometimes. We kind of operate on really high-grade models to make. And so the big deals are like, well, maybe again, the anatomy isn't the way we thought it was. And maybe the mechanics isn't how we thought it was. And those are actually the big things we're doing, is kind of how we interpret the anatomy and behavior, all those things. You've got a microphone there. Oh, there we go.
You just kind of hinted to it with really high fidelity models. You know, with muscles, there's origin and insertion. Do you ever do something where you only have one? Maybe it is like a fragmented skull, and you have to then guess based off like a muscle insertion where you think it would go to help reconstruct the rest of the skull?
No, we haven't had to do that yet. The whole business of doing these big, nice 3D models is to help paleontologists down the road work with scrappier material. So we're trying to lay the foundation out now with the good stuff, so that down the road we can try to plug fragmentary things into models like that and figure out best case scenarios for how things might connect to one another. Back in the back. Ah.
Hey Casey.
Hey Brian.
This is on here. And so I noticed in your triangle plots that you guys modeled the muscle efficiency of Siddipati. It's a Mongolian oviraptorosaur, the one that people have seen like sitting on its nest and stuff. And it was very similar to a modern parrot. And I was wondering if you guys, or at least in your plot, it kind of looked like it was ranging similar. I was wondering if you guys also modeled the cranial kinesis, because parrots have highly kinetic skulls. They do a lot of cool stuff with their bill. And if you'd be willing to talk at all about similarities or differences between raptorosaurs and parrots.
So oviraptors kind of look like parrots. They also look like turtles. And I think they're more like turtles than they are like birds. And that they actually have akinetic skulls. They have additional joints that fortify the skull so it's not mobile at all. And so I think a better ecotype would be like a turtle. And they actually have pretty high bite forces for their size. And they're just chock full of these big old muscles, the beaks, and they're there to be like a big old snapping turtle in a way with feathers. Yeah. Hello.
I was just curious with the blood flow and things with the holes that you were talking about, are any of them like the eardrum, or has that changed in association where you thought that was due to the thermal imaging?
Sure, so eardrums, that's another talk. And I don't do eardrums too much, but those don't hang out on the roof of the skull. They hang out behind the quadrate bone, which is the jaw joint bone. And we actually, as paleontologists, don't have a good idea where that is, because it's got a pretty good bony margin on the front end of where the eardrum might be, but the backside is covered by muscles in these animals. And we have a hard time modeling how big that muscle is. So it's going to require biomechanics of resonance properties of middle ear cavities to get an idea of how big that eardrum needs to be to hit certain frequencies within their stapes bone that's in there. So that's a different kind of project than this, but it's also in a different place. It's cool though, good question. Yeah.
Hi, how are you?
Great.
Couple of things regarding the clamping down force on the alligator. If you look at all their teeth, it looks like they more or less evolved, because teeth are curved inwards, they more or less evolved towards holding on to the prey while they swirl. It would seem to me that they don't need to be able to clamp down to be able to have such force in the beginning.
That's right.
And by the way, have you been to the Shark Valley Loop?
I have. I just went there this summer, down in the Everglades.
That's a great place.
If you ever get to go to Everglades, you should go, because it's getting ruined by anacondas and stuff, so it's pythons.
Go quickly. And I'll forget the fact that you went to DinoFest. I went to FSU.
I heard it, I figured that. That's fine. I went to football camp at FSU back in the day. Anyway, yeah, so alligator joints are cool and their teeth are weird. Alligators themselves are weird. It's probably a different week to talk about it. But they actually evolved from a short-faced group of alligators that were kind of mollusk specialists. So they had kind of crunching teeth and short faces. And today's alligators have gotten longer faces over time and have become less turtle specialists, we think, or mollusk specialists. So they're kind of what we call Longirostrine, Brevirostrine crocs, for what it's worth. And so there's a lot going on. I kind of kept things simple for forces and loads and skulls today. But all these animals don't just do this, which is what I showed today. They don't just do this, but they do this, they do this. Birds have all this crazy stuff going on like that, which is hard to do with statics, which is the engineering stuff I've been showing today. And so if we want to do parrots, like Brian mentioned, we have to do what's called a kinematic analysis. We have to put all these rubber bands on these skulls and move them to show how the muscles are really working in these kind of behaviors, which is really hard. It's hard.
All right, I think we have to wrap things up there. Let's all give Casey a big round.